Alarms tore through the narrow corridors of the Meridian, red light pulsing against steel walls as the deep spaceship shuddered from an impact no one could explain. Captain Laura Bennett gripped the edge of her console, eyes fixed on a sensor screen filling with shapes that should not exist. Something massive had just torn a smaller vessel apart less than 10,000 kilometers away, and the wreckage was tumbling straight toward them. "Report," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Unknown contact. Multiple unknown contacts," called out Ethan Cole from the sensor station, his fingers flying across the controls. "They came out of nowhere. Whatever destroyed that ship is still out there, and it's moving fast." The Meridian had been sent to the outer edge of the solar system to investigate a strange signal, a rhythmic pulse of static, that scientists on Earth believed might be nothing more than interference from a distant star. It was supposed to be a routine mission. Instead, the crew now found themselves staring at the remains of a battle that had clearly been happening long before they arrived. Laura turned to the 4 soldiers stationed near the bridge entrance. They were part of a small security detachment assigned to the mission, men and women trained for situations no one expected to actually happen. Daniel Hartley stood closest to the door, his posture calm but his eyes sharp, already scanning the room for exits and cover. Beside him, Ryan Fletcher checked his weapon out of habit, though he knew it was useless against whatever had just destroyed a ship in seconds. Megan Clark and a third operator named Owen Price stood ready, saying nothing, waiting for orders. "Get to positions," Laura said. "Nobody knows what we're dealing with yet." The words had barely left her mouth when a shape appeared on the main view screen, and the room went silent. It was not a ship, in any way the crew understood ships to be. It was long, dark, covered in shifting plates that caught no light at all, moving with an eerie, almost liquid grace through the black of space. Behind it followed 3 smaller vessels, sleek and fast, closing the distance toward the wreckage field, and the tiny human ship caught in the middle of it. "They're hailing us," said the communications officer, a young woman named Grace Ellison, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't understand the language. I don't think it's meant to be understood." Laura's mind raced. There was no protocol for this. No training exercise had ever prepared her for first contact with an alien species in the middle of what was clearly a battle. But she understood one thing clearly. They were not being greeted. They were being evaluated. "Hold position," she ordered. "Do not provoke them." For a long moment, nothing happened. The massive vessel drifted closer, its surface rippling in a way that made everyone on the bridge uneasy. Then, without warning, a section of its hull opened, and something detached from it, moving toward the Meridian with terrifying speed. "Boarding craft," Ethan called out. "It's going to dock with us." "All hands, brace for impact," Laura shouted, and the ship rocked violently as the smaller craft attached itself to the outer hull, near the cargo bay. Daniel didn't wait for further orders. He nodded to Ryan and Megan, and the 3 of them moved fast, heading for the corridor that led to the cargo section, Owen close behind them. Whatever was coming through that hull, they intended to meet it before it reached the rest of the crew. The metal groaned as something began cutting through the outer door, sparks flying inward, the sound sharp and grinding against the quiet hum of the ship's systems. Daniel positioned himself against the wall, his heart steady despite the unknown waiting on the other side. He had trained for years for moments of pressure, though nothing in that training had ever included aliens. The door gave way with a final screech, and the first of the intruders stepped through. They were tall, taller than any human, their bodies covered in dark armor that seemed to absorb the light around them. Their movements were precise, almost mechanical, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way they scanned the room before advancing, as though they had already calculated every possible outcome of the encounter. Daniel raised a hand, a universal gesture of peace, hoping against hope that reason might work where words could not. The response was immediate and hostile. A beam of energy shot past his shoulder, scorching the wall behind him, and any thought of peaceful contact vanished in an instant. "Move!" Ryan shouted, pulling Daniel behind a stack of cargo containers as another blast tore through the space where he had been standing. What followed was chaos, but it was chaos the 4 operators had trained for their entire careers, even if the enemy was unlike anything they had imagined. Megan rolled to one side, using the tight corridors to her advantage, forcing the invaders to fight in confined spaces where their size became a disadvantage rather than a strength. Owen worked to seal off sections of the ship, cutting the intruders off from reaching the rest of the crew, buying precious time with every door he closed. The invaders fought with strange, powerful weapons, but they fought expecting an enemy that would break and retreat under pressure. Instead, they found 4 humans who refused to yield ground, who used the narrow halls and low light to disappear and reappear where least expected, striking fast and pulling back before the enemy could respond. Daniel ducked beneath another blast, feeling the heat of it pass just above his head, and drove forward, disabling the nearest attacker with a precise strike to a joint in its armor that Ryan had spotted only seconds before. The armored figure staggered, and for the first time since the fighting began, something like uncertainty crossed its features. They had not expected resistance like this. Minutes passed like hours, the 4 operators moving as a single unit, despite having no time to plan or communicate, beyond quick glances and instinct built from years of working together. Every time the invaders adjusted their approach, the humans adjusted faster, using the ship itself as a weapon, luring the intruders into narrow spaces, cutting power to sections to plunge them into darkness, where human eyes, trained for years in low-visibility conditions, held an unexpected advantage. On the bridge, Laura watched the ship's internal sensors with growing disbelief, as the small security team held their ground against an enemy that had, moments earlier, destroyed a fully armed vessel without apparent effort. "They're pushing them back," Ethan said, astonishment clear in his voice. "I don't believe it. They're actually pushing them back." The turning point came when Daniel spotted a weakness in the invaders' coordination. They fought well individually, but their tactics assumed an enemy who would panic under pressure, who would scatter rather than regroup. Every time the humans regrouped instead of scattering, the invaders hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and that fraction of a second was all Daniel and his team needed. With a final coordinated effort, the 4 operators forced the remaining invaders back toward the boarding craft, refusing to let them gain any further ground inside the ship. Whatever silent communication passed between the alien attackers, it was enough. The intruders retreated, sealing themselves back into their craft, which detached from the Meridian's hull and pulled away with startling speed. On the massive vessel outside, deep within a command chamber lit by cold blue light, an alien commander named Korath Ven stared at reports flooding across his display, disbelief settling into something far more troubling. The small human ship, primitive by every measure his forces had encountered, had repelled a boarding assault meant to subdue and capture. His soldiers, among the most disciplined in the Dominion's forces, had been forced into retreat by 4 unarmored, undertrained creatures fighting in nothing more than makeshift defense. He should have ordered a full assault immediately. Instead, he found himself pausing, recalculating, uncertain for the first time in a long while. "Withdraw," he finally said, his voice quiet in the vast chamber. "Mark this system as unresolved. Flag the species as unknown and dangerous." Aboard the Meridian, the crew gathered in stunned silence as the massive alien vessel and its remaining escorts pulled away, vanishing into the dark beyond their sensors' range. Daniel leaned against the cargo bay wall, breathing hard, Ryan and Megan beside him, Owen checking the sealed doors one final time before allowing himself to relax. "What was that?" Megan finally said, not really a question, more an attempt to make sense of what had just happened. Nobody had an answer. Laura made her way down from the bridge, finding the 4 operators still catching their breath among the damaged cargo containers. She looked at each of them in turn, seeing something new in their eyes, a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief at what they had just survived. "We need to get back to Earth," she said quietly. "They need to know what's out there. And they need to know what you 4 just did." As the Meridian turned back toward home, its damaged hull trailing behind it like a wounded animal returning to its den, none of them yet understood the significance of what had just happened in that cargo bay. They did not know that word of the encounter would travel far beyond their small, damaged ship, carried through channels they could not imagine, spoken in languages they had never heard, whispered among species they did not know existed. They did not know that somewhere among the stars, a name was already beginning to form, born from confusion, fear, and grudging respect. a name that would follow humanity across the galaxy long after this first encounter faded into memory. For now, they only knew one thing with certainty. Whatever waited for them beyond the edge of their solar system, humanity was no longer alone, and there would be no going back to the quiet world they had left behind. The Meridian limped back into Earth orbit 3 weeks later, its hull scarred, its crew changed in ways none of them could fully explain to the officials waiting to debrief them. What began as a quiet scientific mission had become the first confirmed contact between humanity and an alien civilization, and the news, once verified, spread through Earth's governments like wildfire contained just barely within closed doors. Commander Nathan Price stood at the head of a long table inside a secure briefing room beneath Geneva, listening as Laura Bennett recounted the events aboard the Meridian for what felt like the 100th time. Around the table sat representatives from a dozen nations, along with senior officers from what remained of Earth's Unified Defense Command, a body that had been assembled decades earlier for exactly this kind of unthinkable scenario. "You're telling me 4 operators held off an assault from a ship capable of destroying another vessel in seconds," said one of the representatives, skepticism heavy in his voice. "I'm telling you what I saw," Laura replied evenly, "and what my sensors recorded. I have no explanation for why it worked. I only know that it did." Nathan studied the footage playing on the screen behind her, grainy and incomplete, but enough to confirm every detail of her report. He had spent 30 years in military service, most of it preparing for conflicts between nations, never once imagining he would spend his final years preparing Earth for a war against something from beyond the stars. "They're coming back," he said finally, cutting through the arguments that had begun to build around the table. "Whatever we saw in that footage was a probe, a test. They will return, and next time they will not send a small boarding party. We need every available resource focused on defense, starting now." The weeks that followed moved fast. Special Forces units from every corner of Earth were pulled from existing assignments and brought together under a single command structure. Training intensified beyond anything most of the operators had previously experienced. Daniel Hartley found himself assigned to lead a new joint unit, working alongside Ryan Fletcher, Megan Clark, and dozens of other soldiers gathered from different countries, different backgrounds, united only by their skill and their willingness to face an enemy none of them fully understood. Grace Ellison, still processing what she had witnessed on the bridge of the Meridian, was brought into a research division tasked with analyzing every scrap of data recovered from the encounter. Alongside a team of scientists and engineers, she worked to understand the alien technology, the strange language captured in fragments of communication, anything that might give humanity an edge in the conflict everyone now knew was coming. It did not take long for the Dominion to return, and when they did, they came in force. The first wave arrived without warning above the Pacific, a fleet of ships descending through the atmosphere, with a silence that made the assault feel even more unnatural. Cities scrambled to evacuate as defense forces mobilized, but Earth's weapons, built to fight other humans, barely scratched the alien hulls. Within hours, several coastal defense installations had fallen silent, and ground forces reported enemy units advancing with a speed and coordination that outmatched anything in Earth's military history. Daniel's unit was deployed to a coastal city already half evacuated, tasked with slowing the alien advance long enough for civilians to reach safety further inland. Standing at the edge of a ruined street, watching enemy shapes moving through the smoke and dust in the distance, he understood clearly that conventional tactics would not be enough. "We can't fight them head-on," he said to the small team gathered around him, all of them watching the approaching enemy with grim focus. "We use the city. We use everything we know that they don't." What followed became one of the defining stories of the early war, though few outside the immediate area would learn the full details for years. Daniel's team split into smaller groups, moving through the ruined streets and buildings with practiced precision, striking at isolated enemy units before disappearing into the wreckage before reinforcements could respond. They used the chaos of the evacuation to their advantage, blending with the environment, striking from angles the alien forces had not accounted for. Megan led a small group through the underground subway tunnels beneath the city, using the confined, dark spaces to ambush enemy patrols attempting to flank the human defensive lines. The tunnels became a nightmare for the invaders, who found their advanced sensors less effective in the maze of concrete and steel, giving the humans a critical advantage in an environment they knew intimately, and the enemy did not. Above ground, Ryan coordinated with what remained of the city's defense grid, redirecting power to create false signals, confusing enemy targeting systems long enough for teams to reposition unseen. It was imperfect, improvised, and dangerous, but it worked far better than anyone had expected. By the time the sun set on that first day of ground conflict, the alien advance into the city had stalled completely, their forces pulling back to regroup, rather than press further into unfamiliar and increasingly hostile territory. It was not a victory in any traditional sense, but it was enough. It proved that humanity could hold ground, even against overwhelming technological superiority. Reports of similar resistance came in from other cities across the globe. Special forces units, deployed in small, mobile groups, found ways to slow the alien advance through unconventional means, refusing to engage in the kind of large-scale confrontations the Dominion's forces were built to dominate. Instead, they fought a different kind of conflict entirely, one built on unpredictability, resilience, and an unwillingness to simply give up ground without extracting a heavy cost. Aboard one of the Dominion's command vessels, stationed above the Atlantic, a senior officer named Sylvain Dross reviewed incoming reports with growing frustration. Sylvain had overseen dozens of successful campaigns against other species across the galaxy, campaigns that typically ended within days, once resistance had been sufficiently demonstrated to be futile. This campaign was different. Every engagement report described the same pattern: human forces refusing to break, adapting faster than expected, striking from unexpected angles, and retreating before losses could be inflicted in return. "Casualties are within acceptable limits," reported a subordinate officer, "but our advance rate has fallen far below projections. The human forces do not fight according to any pattern our analysis systems recognize." Sylvain studied the data in silence, recalling the earlier report from Korath Ven regarding the small human vessel that had repelled a boarding assault months earlier. At the time, it had seemed an anomaly, an unusual outcome that did not reflect the broader capabilities of the species. Now, watching similar patterns repeat across multiple cities on this small, technologically primitive world, a different picture began to emerge. "Increase force projection in the next wave," Sylvain ordered. "These humans will not withstand a full-scale assault indefinitely." But even as the order was given, doubt lingered in a way that Sylvain found difficult to acknowledge. There was something unsettling about an enemy that continued fighting long after logic suggested they should surrender, something that did not fit neatly into the calculations that had guided Dominion military strategy for generations. Back on Earth, the cost of the growing conflict weighed heavily on everyone involved. Daniel's unit, exhausted from days of continuous engagement, gathered in a makeshift command post set up within the ruins of an old university building, using whatever shelter remained standing to plan their next moves. Grace arrived from the research division, carrying updated intelligence, gathered from captured alien equipment, and fragments of communication intercepted during the fighting. "We're starting to understand their language," she explained, spreading a series of translated notes across a makeshift table. "It's not much, but there's something interesting here. In their reports, in the way they describe the fighting, there's a word that keeps appearing when referring to our forces. It doesn't translate perfectly, but the closest meaning is something like an ending, a final and irreversible outcome. Some of the linguists are translating it simply as death." Daniel looked at the notes for a long moment, understanding the weight of what Grace was describing, even before she finished explaining. Somewhere among the vast, unknown reaches of a galaxy Earth had known nothing about only months earlier, humanity's soldiers were being spoken of not by name, not by rank, but by the fear and uncertainty they had managed to instill in a force that had, until now, never known true resistance. "Let them call us whatever they want," Ryan said quietly from across the room, arms crossed, his eyes distant with exhaustion. "As long as it keeps them second-guessing every move they make." Megan nodded in silent agreement, though the weight of the ongoing conflict was visible in the tired lines of her face. None of them had asked for this war. None of them had imagined, even months earlier, that they would find themselves fighting to defend not just their country or their continent, but their entire world, against a threat from beyond the stars. Outside, the sounds of the ongoing conflict continued in the distance, A reminder that despite the small victories won in scattered cities across the globe, the true test of humanity's resolve was only just beginning. The Dominion, as Sylvain had promised, was already preparing a larger, more coordinated assault, one designed to overwhelm the resistance that had proven so unexpectedly effective in these early engagements. As night fell over the ruined city, Daniel stood near a shattered window, looking out over the darkened skyline, thinking not of the battles already fought, but of the ones still to come. Somewhere above, hidden among the stars, an enemy fleet was regrouping, preparing to test humanity's resolve once again. And somewhere among the countless worlds of a galaxy still largely unknown to Earth, a name whispered in fear and uncertainty was beginning to take hold, carried by soldiers who had never asked to become legends, only survivors, determined to protect the only home they had ever known. The following days brought a strange kind of quiet to the war, a pause that no one on Earth fully trusted. Reports from orbital sensors, hastily repaired and reinforced by Grace's research team using recovered alien technology, showed Dominion forces consolidating rather than retreating entirely. It was clear to everyone involved that the enemy was regrouping, studying their earlier failures, preparing an approach better suited to overcoming the resistance they had not expected to encounter. Nathan Price used the reprieve to reorganize Earth's fractured defense forces into something more cohesive, drawing on the lessons learned from the scattered, improvised resistance efforts across multiple cities. Special Forces units, having proven their effectiveness far beyond what traditional military doctrine would have predicted, became the backbone of a new defensive strategy, built around speed, adaptability, and calculated unpredictability, rather than direct confrontation. Daniel's unit, along with several others, was given a new designation, quietly acknowledging the reputation they had already begun to earn among both human commanders and, unknowingly, among the alien forces they fought against. It was not an official title bestowed with ceremony, but something that emerged naturally from the growing body of reports describing their actions across multiple engagements. As preparations continued for what everyone understood would be a far larger confrontation, Daniel found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought him here, from a routine security assignment aboard a research vessel to leading soldiers in defense of an entire planet against a force from beyond human understanding. There was no time for uncertainty, no room for hesitation. Whatever waited in the days ahead, humanity's resistance would need to grow stronger, faster, and more determined than ever before. Above the planet, unseen by those below, Dominion forces continued their preparations, unaware that the very qualities they viewed as an unpredictable and troubling anomaly were about to become the foundation of humanity's defense against an empire that had never before faced an adversary quite like this one. Far beyond the edge of the solar system, in regions of space that Earth's astronomers had only ever seen as distant points of light, word of the strange, resistant species began to travel along trade routes and communication channels that stretched across dozens of star systems. The Dominion controlled a vast network of worlds, some conquered generations ago, others bound by agreements made under threat rather than choice. Among these worlds lived species who had long ago learned to survive quietly beneath Dominion rule, watching, listening, and waiting for any sign that their conquerors were not as unstoppable as they claimed to be. On a mining colony orbiting a distant gas giant, a trader named Vesoon Kale listened carefully as a Dominion transport crew exchanged rumors over drinks in a dimly lit dockside tavern. Vesoon belonged to a species called the Ferai, tall and thin with pale, luminous skin adapted to the low light of their homeworld, a species that had been under Dominion control for nearly 2 centuries. Vesoon had learned long ago the value of listening closely to anything the occupying forces said when they believed no one of consequence was paying attention. "They fight like something broken loose from a nightmare," one of the crew members said, his voice lowered, though clearly still shaken by whatever he had witnessed. "You corner them, and they don't stop. You wound them, and they keep coming. My unit lost half its number in an engagement that should have taken minutes. It took hours, and we still didn't hold the ground." "What world was this?" Vesoon asked casually, refilling the crew member's drink, careful not to appear too interested. "A small world, mostly water. 3rd planet from a yellow star near the outer reaches," the crew member replied. "Command calls the species human. My unit calls them something else. Vassoon said nothing further, simply nodding, as though the conversation held little significance, though internally, something had shifted. Stories like this rarely emerged from Dominion soldiers, who were trained rigorously to avoid displaying anything resembling doubt or fear regarding their military campaigns. That such stories were beginning to circulate, quietly at first, then with increasing frequency across multiple outposts and colonies, suggested something significant was happening on that small, distant world. Within weeks, the story had spread far beyond that single dockside tavern. Traders carried it between star systems, soldiers whispered it among themselves during quiet moments between deployments, and slowly, cautiously, it began reaching the ears of resistance groups scattered across various Dominion-controlled worlds, groups who had long ago given up hope of ever seeing their conquerors face genuine, sustained defiance. Details shifted and grew with each retelling, as stories often do when passed between those who had not directly witnessed the events themselves. Some accounts described humans as nearly unstoppable, capable of continuing to fight through injuries that would have ended the resistance of any other species encountered by the Dominion. Others focused on their unpredictability, describing tactics that seemed to defy the logical, methodical approach the Dominion's forces were trained to expect from any opponent. The word used by frightened Dominion soldiers to describe the human forces, the same word Grace Ellison's team had identified weeks earlier, began appearing more frequently in these second-hand accounts, translated imperfectly across dozens of different languages and dialects, yet somehow retaining its unsettling weight no matter the translation. Among many of the species who heard these stories, the closest equivalent word in their own languages became attached to the humans as an informal, almost mythical designation, spoken with a mixture of fear, curiosity, and cautious hope. On Earth, Nathan Price received intelligence reports compiled by Grace's research division detailing the spread of these rumors, information gathered through intercepted Dominion communications, and, remarkably, through contact established with several resistance groups on Dominion-controlled worlds who had begun reaching out, cautiously and carefully, toward the species whose defiance had captured their attention. "They're calling us something," Nathan said during a briefing attended by senior military leadership and several key figures from the ongoing defense effort, including Daniel and Laura, both of whom had been brought into a more strategic role, given their first-hand experience with the enemy. It doesn't translate perfectly into any single word, but the closest meaning across multiple languages carries connotations of an ending, a finality, something unavoidable. "Death," Grace said quietly from where she stood near the back of the room. "That's the word the linguists keep settling on. It's not exact, but it captures the general meaning." A heavy silence settled over the room as everyone considered the implications. Somewhere among the stars, an entire galaxy of species who had never known Earth existed were now speaking of humanity, and specifically of the Special Forces units defending their world, using a word carrying weight and fear, far beyond anything any of them had anticipated. "This could work in our favor," Laura said finally, breaking the silence. "Fear can be a powerful deterrent. If the Dominion's own forces are hesitant, uncertain, second-guessing every engagement, that uncertainty gives us an advantage we desperately need." Nathan considered this carefully before responding. "It's a double-edged blade. Fear might slow their advance, but it could also push them toward more extreme measures if they come to see us as a threat, requiring complete elimination rather than simple conquest." The conversation that followed shaped much of Earth's strategy in the weeks ahead. Rather than attempting to downplay or dismiss the growing reputation, military leadership made a calculated decision to lean into it, using it as a psychological tool against an enemy that had, until now, always relied on overwhelming force and the assumption of inevitable victory to secure quick, decisive campaigns against other species. Special Forces units were given greater autonomy in the field, encouraged to continue employing the unpredictable, decentralized tactics that had already proven so effective, tactics that played directly into the growing uncertainty among Dominion forces. Daniel's unit, along with several others operating in different regions, began deliberately leaving behind evidence of their engagements, designed to reinforce the unsettling reputation already taking hold, not through cruelty or excess, but through calculated demonstrations of skill and resolve, intended to further erode enemy confidence. Meanwhile, on Dominion-controlled worlds scattered throughout the galaxy. The growing stories about humanity began to inspire something the Dominion had worked hard to suppress for generations: hope. Resistance groups who had long ago resigned themselves to quiet survival under occupation began to organize more openly, drawing inspiration from a species willing to fight against odds far greater than anything they themselves had previously dared to challenge. Vesun Kale, having heard countless variations of the human story over the following weeks, made a decision that would change the course of the growing conflict in ways not even Vesun could have anticipated. Using contacts built over years of careful, quiet resistance work, Vesun began reaching out to other groups across Dominion territory, sharing information about the distant world called Earth, about the species fighting there, with a determination that seemed to be shaking the very foundations of Dominion confidence. If they can hold their world against Dominion forces, Vesun explained during a secretive meeting held deep within the mining colony's lower levels, attended by representatives from several resistance cells across neighboring systems, then perhaps the idea of the Dominion being unbeatable was never true to begin with. Perhaps we have simply never had allies willing to prove it. The meeting marked the beginning of a fragile, cautious network forming across multiple star systems, groups who had never previously coordinated with one another, now finding common cause in the distant example set by a species most of them had never seen, and knew only through second-hand stories carried across the stars. Aboard the Dominion's primary command vessel stationed above Earth's northern hemisphere, Sylvain Dros faced growing pressure from Dominion leadership, who had begun receiving troubling reports, not only regarding the ongoing campaign against Earth, but regarding subtle shifts in behavior among various subject species across the Empire. Reports of increased resistance activity, previously rare and easily suppressed, were now appearing, with concerning frequency across multiple sectors. The situation on this world was meant to be resolved within weeks, came the voice of a senior Dominion official during a tense communication relayed across vast distances of space. Instead, months have passed, and now we are seeing troubling patterns emerging across unrelated territories. Explain this. Sylvain considered the question carefully before responding, aware that the answer carried significant weight. The human forces do not fight according to patterns our strategic systems are designed to counter. Their resistance has proven more effective than initial assessments predicted, and reports of their engagements have apparently spread beyond this system, inspiring unrest among other subject populations. Then eliminate the source of this inspiration, the official replied coldly. End the resistance on this world swiftly and decisively, before the example it sets undermines stability across the entire Dominion. The order weighed heavily on Sylvain, who understood better than the distant leadership issuing it just how difficult ending the resistance on Earth had already proven to be. Previous campaigns against other species had rarely required more than a demonstration of overwhelming force before resistance collapsed entirely. This campaign had defied every expectation, and now the stakes had grown far beyond simply conquering a single, isolated world. Back on Earth, Daniel stood on a hillside overlooking a valley, where his unit had established a new forward position, watching the sun set over a landscape forever changed by the ongoing conflict. Ryan and Megan sat nearby, along with several newer members who had joined the unit in recent weeks, drawn from special forces programs across the globe, all of them now operating under a single, unified command structure built around the lessons learned during the earliest days of the war. You've heard what they're calling us, Ryan said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over the group. Daniel nodded, having received the briefing from Nathan's team days earlier. Death, he said simply, the word feeling strange on his tongue, given the context in which it had emerged. Feels strange, Megan admitted. We're not trying to be anything except what we've always been, soldiers protecting our home. Maybe that's exactly why it works, Daniel replied thoughtfully. We're not fighting for conquest or glory. We're fighting because we have no other choice, and that kind of determination is harder to break than anything built on ambition. The conversation drifted quietly into the growing darkness, each of them carrying their own thoughts about the strange, unexpected reputation they had earned across a galaxy they had known nothing about only months earlier. None of them had asked to become symbols of resistance, feared and whispered about across countless worlds. Yet here they were, carrying a weight far beyond anything they could have imagined when they first signed up to serve their countries, long before the concept of an alien invasion had ever crossed their minds. Elsewhere across the war-torn regions of Earth, similar conversations played out among other units, other soldiers grappling with the strange new reality of their situation. The initial shock and fear that had defined the earliest days of the conflict had begun to shift into something more resolute. A growing understanding that despite the overwhelming technological gap separating humanity from the Dominion, resilience and adaptability could still carry weight against even the most advanced adversary. Grace Ellison, working late into the night within the Research Division's underground facility, continued analyzing captured Dominion technology and intercepted communications, searching for any advantage that might further tip the balance in humanity's favor. Alongside her team, she had begun identifying patterns in Dominion tactics, subtle shifts suggesting growing hesitation and uncertainty among enemy commanders, information that would prove invaluable as the conflict entered its next, more dangerous phase. As the days passed, the fragile network of resistance groups quietly organizing across Dominion territory continued to grow, inspired by the ongoing defiance demonstrated on the small, distant world, now spoken of in hushed, respectful tones, across dozens of star systems. Though none of these scattered groups yet possessed the strength to openly challenge Dominion authority, the seeds of a much larger rebellion had been planted, seeds that would, in time, grow into something the Dominion had never before faced across its long, largely unchallenged history of conquest. On Earth, preparations continued for the larger, more devastating assault everyone understood the Dominion was assembling in response to the unexpected resistance encountered thus far. Special Forces units trained relentlessly, refining the tactics that had proven so effective, while developing new strategies designed to counter whatever the Dominion might bring in their next wave of attacks. Nathan Price worked tirelessly alongside representatives from nations across the globe, ensuring that Earth's fractured defense forces remained as unified and coordinated as possible in the face of the growing threat. And far above, hidden among the stars, Sylvain Dross prepared to launch a campaign unlike anything previously deployed against a single world, driven by mounting pressure from Dominion leadership and a growing, uneasy recognition that this small, defiant planet had become something far more significant than a simple military objective. It had become, whether the Dominion wished to acknowledge it or not, a test of whether their empire's long, unquestioned dominance could truly withstand a challenge from an enemy who refused, against every expectation, to break. Deep within a reinforced facility built into the mountains of Central Europe, Grace Ellison stood before a wall of screens displaying schematics recovered from a damaged Dominion scout vessel, captured weeks earlier during a raid led by Daniel's unit. The technology represented centuries of advancement beyond anything Earth had previously developed, yet piece by piece, her team had begun unlocking its secrets, translating alien engineering principles into designs that human factories, working around the clock, could actually produce. The power distribution system is the key, she explained to a gathered group of engineers and military officials, pointing toward a section of the schematic, glowing softly on the screen. Their weapons draw energy far more efficiently than anything we've built. If we can replicate even a fraction of this efficiency, we can close the gap between our capabilities and theirs. The months following the growing recognition of humanity's reputation across distant star systems had brought a shift in the nature of the conflict. Earth scientists and engineers, driven by necessity and armed with fragments of recovered alien technology, worked tirelessly to develop weapons and defenses capable of standing against the Dominion's forces on more even terms. Progress came slowly, marked by countless failures and setbacks, but gradually, steadily, the technological gap that had once seemed impossibly vast began to narrow. Nathan Price authorized a new phase of operations, moving beyond simple defense toward a more aggressive strategy designed to disrupt the Dominion's ability to wage war effectively. Special Forces units, having spent months perfecting tactics suited to holding ground against overwhelming force, now turned their attention toward striking deep into territory the Dominion considered secure, targeting supply lines, communication relays, and critical infrastructure, supporting the ongoing campaign against Earth. Daniel's unit was selected for one of the earliest and most ambitious of these operations, a mission requiring them to infiltrate a Dominion supply depot established on the far side of the Moon, a facility supporting the ongoing assault against Earth's surface. The mission carried enormous risk, requiring the team to travel beyond the relative safety of their homeworld into territory controlled entirely by the enemy. But the potential reward, disrupting the flow of resources sustaining the Dominion's campaign, was considered worth the danger. The infiltration began under cover of darkness. The team's small transport craft, built using recovered alien stealth technology, slipping quietly past Dominion patrols stationed in lunar orbit. Daniel led Ryan, Megan, and 3 additional operators through the cold, airless terrain toward the depot, moving carefully across the harsh lunar landscape, using equipment adapted specifically for the unforgiving environment. Inside the depot, Dominion personnel moved through their routines with the confident efficiency of a force that had never expected to face direct assault so far from the primary conflict zone. That confidence proved to be a critical vulnerability. Daniel's team moved through the facility with practiced precision, disabling security systems and neutralizing resistance quickly and quietly, buying enough time to place charges designed to cripple the depot's primary supply reserves without requiring a prolonged, dangerous confrontation. The resulting explosion, visible even from Earth's surface as a brief flash against the lunar landscape, sent shockwaves through Dominion command structures, far beyond the immediate loss of resources. It represented something far more significant than material damage, proof that humanity's forces could strike effectively beyond the boundaries of their own world, carrying the fight directly to the enemy, rather than simply defending against it. News of the successful raid spread quickly among the resistance networks that had continued growing quietly across Dominion territory since the earliest rumors of humanity's defiance first began circulating months earlier. Vesun Kale, having maintained careful contact with several resistance cells throughout the ongoing conflict, received word of the lunar depot raid within days, the story carrying renewed hope and determination among groups who had, until now, only heard second-hand accounts of humanity's resistance. They are not simply surviving, Vesun explained, during a gathering of resistance representatives held in the shadowed lower levels of the mining colony. They are actively fighting back, striking directly against Dominion operations. If they can accomplish this on their own world, imagine what might be possible if those of us who have lived under Dominion control for generations found the courage to do the same. The gathering marked a turning point for the fragile network Vesun had worked to build over recent months. What had begun as cautious, isolated resistance cells sharing information began transforming into something more organized, more determined, inspired directly by the ongoing example set on the distant world, now spoken of with growing reverence across dozens of star systems. On Earth, the success of the lunar raid encouraged military leadership to expand the scope of similar operations. Special Forces units, working alongside Grace's research division, which continued refining captured alien technology into usable human equipment, began conducting a series of coordinated strikes against Dominion assets throughout the solar system, gradually eroding the enemy's ability to sustain their ongoing campaign against Earth's surface. Sylvain Dross, facing mounting pressure from increasingly frustrated Dominion leadership, watched as reports of successful human operations continued accumulating faster than replacement resources could be secured from distant supply lines already strained by the unexpectedly prolonged conflict. What had begun as a routine campaign to subdue a technologically primitive world had transformed into a costly, drawn-out struggle, threatening to undermine confidence in Dominion military capability across the entire empire. "We require reinforcements," Sylvain reported, during another tense communication with distant Dominion leadership. "The human forces have adapted faster than any species previously encountered, and their attacks against our supply infrastructure have significantly hampered our ability to sustain effective operations against their homeworld." The response carried barely restrained frustration. Reinforcements are already stretched thin, addressing growing unrest across multiple sectors, unrest apparently inspired, at least in part, by the ongoing situation on this single world. You will need to resolve this conflict using the resources already available to you. The admission, though delivered coldly and without acknowledgement of its deeper implications, confirmed what Sylvain had already begun to suspect. The conflict on Earth had grown into something far larger than a simple military campaign. It had become a symbol, a rallying point for discontent that had likely existed quietly across the Dominion's vast territory for generations. Discontent, now finding renewed courage, in the example set by a species refusing to accept the inevitability of Dominion rule. Recognizing the shifting nature of the conflict, Nathan Price authorized what would become the most significant operation of the war thus far, a coordinated assault against a major Dominion shipyard located within a nearby star system, a facility responsible for constructing and repairing much of the fleet currently engaged in operations against Earth. Success would represent a devastating blow to the Dominion's ongoing campaign, potentially crippling their ability to sustain the conflict at its current intensity. The operation required unprecedented cooperation, not only among Earth's various Special Forces units, but with several resistance groups from Dominion-controlled worlds who had, through channels established by Vesun Kale and others like them, reached out offering assistance in exchange for the chance to strike a meaningful blow against their longtime occupiers. Daniel found himself leading a joint operation unlike anything he had previously experienced, coordinating not only with familiar human units, but with representatives from several alien species who had lived under Dominion control for generations, each bringing their own knowledge of the target facility and the surrounding region gained through years of careful, quiet observation. Among these allies was Vesun Kale, who had traveled personally to coordinate the operation, meeting Daniel and his team for the first time aboard a modified transport vessel making its way toward the target system under careful stealth protocols developed jointly between human and resistance engineers. "Your reputation precedes you," Vesuan said during their first meeting, studying Daniel with an expression difficult to read given the unfamiliar features of the Farai species. "Though I confess, the stories rarely mention how young you all appear, for soldiers said to instill such fear across the stars." "We're not trying to instill fear," Daniel replied honestly. "We're trying to protect our home, same as I imagine you're trying to protect yours." Vesun nodded slowly, something like understanding passing between them despite the vast differences separating their species. Then perhaps that shared purpose is exactly what will make this operation successful. The assault on the shipyard began under cover of a coordinated distraction, resistance forces striking at outlying defense installations, while Daniel's team, along with several other Special Forces units, infiltrated the facility's core structures, using knowledge provided by their alien allies regarding vulnerabilities the Dominion had never anticipated being exploited by an organized, coordinated assault. The fighting that followed was fierce and prolonged, unlike the smaller, more contained engagements that had characterized much of the conflict thus far. Dominion forces, caught off guard by the scale and coordination of the assault, struggled to mount an effective defense against an enemy attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, employing tactics informed by generations of quiet observation, combined with the adaptable, unpredictable approach that had already proven so effective against Dominion forces on Earth. Ryan and Megan led a team responsible for disabling the shipyard's primary defense systems, working alongside a group of resistance fighters who guided them through service corridors, known only to those who had spent years working within the facility, under Dominion oversight. Their combined efforts succeeded in creating critical openings that allowed the broader assault to press deeper into the facility's core structures. Daniel, working alongside Vesun, and a small team tasked with reaching the facility's primary control center, encountered fierce resistance from Dominion forces, determined to protect what remained one of their most critical strategic assets. The fighting grew intense, but the combined skill and determination of the joint human and alien forces gradually overwhelmed the increasingly desperate Dominion defense. With the control center finally secured, engineers among the resistance forces worked quickly to trigger a cascading failure throughout the shipyard's critical systems, ensuring the facility would remain unusable for an extended period regardless of any subsequent Dominion efforts toward repair. As the joint forces withdrew from the crippled facility, the true scale of their success became apparent. The Dominion's ability to sustain their ongoing campaign against Earth had been dealt a blow from which recovery would prove difficult and costly. News of the shipyard's destruction spread rapidly, carrying far greater weight than any previous demonstration of resistance against Dominion authority. For the first time in generations, an organized, coordinated assault involving multiple species had successfully struck at the heart of Dominion military infrastructure, proving decisively that the Empire's long unquestioned dominance was far from invulnerable. Within the highest levels of Dominion leadership, the destruction of the shipyard forced an emergency council to convene, senior officials gathering to address not only the immediate military setback, but the far more troubling implications regarding growing unrest across multiple sectors of their vast territory. The conflict that had begun as a routine campaign against a single, technologically primitive world had evolved into something threatening the very stability of the Empire itself. The situation has grown beyond a simple military matter, argued one council member during the tense proceedings. Continued conflict risks inspiring further unrest among subject populations, already showing troubling signs of unauthorized coordination. We must consider whether continued pursuit of this campaign serves the Dominion's broader interests. The debate that followed carried significant weight, senior Dominion officials forced to confront uncomfortable questions regarding the true cost of continuing a campaign that had already proven far more costly, in both resources and stability, than anyone had originally anticipated. Though no immediate decision emerged from the Council's deliberations, the seeds of doubt regarding the viability of continued conflict had been firmly planted among even the most senior levels of Dominion leadership. On Earth, celebrations remained cautious despite the significant victory achieved at the shipyard, everyone involved understanding that the Dominion, wounded but far from defeated, remained a formidable threat capable of significant retaliation. Yet amid the careful optimism, a growing sense of possibility had taken hold. A recognition that the war, once assumed unwinnable, given the vast technological gap separating humanity from their adversary, might yet end in something other than Earth's complete subjugation. Daniel stood alongside Vasoon and the rest of the joint operation team aboard the transport vessel, making its way back toward Earth, watching the distant stars through a viewport, contemplating the strange, unexpected alliances that had formed throughout the course of this unprecedented conflict. "What happens now?" Daniel asked quietly, more to himself than to anyone in particular. "Now," Vasoon replied thoughtfully, "we continue. Word of what happened here will spread far beyond what either of us can currently imagine. Whatever comes next, the Dominion can no longer claim the certainty of victory they once took for granted." As their vessel continued its journey back toward Earth, neither of them yet knew just how significant the coming weeks would prove to be, nor the full scope of the changes already beginning to unfold across a galaxy increasingly aware that the Empire long assumed unshakable had finally begun to show cracks in its once impenetrable foundation. In the months following the destruction of the shipyard, the balance of the conflict shifted in ways few had dared to predict when the first Dominion ships appeared above Earth's cities. What had once seemed an impossible war against an overwhelming, unstoppable force had transformed into a grinding, uncertain struggle in which neither side could claim clear advantage, and it was within this uncertainty that the true cost of continued conflict began weighing heavily on Dominion leadership. Reports of unrest continued arriving from across the Empire's vast territory, resistance movements emboldened by the ongoing example set on Earth, drawing courage from a species that had, against every expectation, refused to accept defeat despite facing an adversary possessing technology centuries beyond their own. Vasoon Kale's careful network of contacts had grown into something far more significant than anyone involved could have initially imagined, coordinating acts of resistance across dozens of star systems, each success further undermining the perception of inevitable Dominion dominance that had sustained the Empire's control for generations. Sylvain Dross, having overseen the campaign against Earth since its earliest days, found the burden of the ongoing conflict increasingly difficult to bear. What had begun as a straightforward military assignment had evolved into a defining struggle threatening the stability of the entire Dominion, and the weight of that responsibility showed clearly in the careful, measured reports Sylvain continued submitting to increasingly anxious Dominion leadership. Continued engagement on this world consumes resources we cannot spare, given the growing unrest across other sectors, Sylvain argued during a critical council session convened to determine the future direction of the campaign. Every additional week of conflict here strengthens the resolve of resistance movements elsewhere, movements drawing direct inspiration from our continued failure to subdue this single, defiant world. The argument, though difficult for many within the council to accept, carried undeniable weight given the mounting evidence gathered over the preceding months. What had once been dismissed as an isolated anomaly, a single world's unusual capacity for resistance, had grown into a symbol threatening the foundation upon which Dominion authority across the galaxy had long been built. After extended deliberation, the Council reached a decision few among the Dominion's senior leadership had ever imagined necessary: a formal approach toward negotiation with the human forces, seeking an end to hostilities that had already cost far more than initial projections had anticipated, both in terms of military resources and, more critically, in terms of the Empire's broader stability. The proposal reached Earth through channels established during the earlier joint operation against the Dominion shipyard, carried initially through resistance networks before being formally transmitted to Nathan Price and the assembled leadership overseeing Earth's defense efforts. The announcement, when it came, was met with a mixture of relief, disbelief, and cautious hope among a population that had spent months bracing for continued, escalating conflict. "They want to negotiate," Nathan announced during a briefing attended by military leadership, government representatives, and key figures who had shaped the course of the resistance since its earliest days, including Daniel, Laura, Grace, and several others whose contributions had proven instrumental throughout the conflict. "After everything," Laura said quietly, struggling to reconcile the news with months of relentless, exhausting struggle against an enemy that had once seemed entirely beyond negotiation or compromise. "They're not doing this out of generosity," Grace added, having spent recent weeks analyzing intercepted communications, suggesting growing instability within Dominion leadership. "Their empire is fracturing. Unrest is spreading across their territory, inspired directly by what we've managed to accomplish here. Negotiating with us isn't mercy, it's necessity." The negotiations that followed proved lengthy and complex, requiring careful diplomatic work from representatives on both sides, attempting to bridge not only significant cultural and technological differences, but also the deep mistrust built through months of costly, painful conflict. Nathan Price led Earth's delegation, accompanied by representatives from across the globe, determined to ensure that whatever agreement emerged would secure lasting protection for their world, rather than merely a temporary pause in hostilities. Daniel, though not directly involved in the diplomatic proceedings, found himself increasingly drawn into discussions regarding the terms being proposed, his first-hand experience fighting against Dominion forces providing valuable perspective regarding what guarantees would genuinely ensure Earth's continued safety and sovereignty going forward. "They'll try to secure terms that leave room for future action against us," Daniel warned during one strategic planning session held alongside Nathan's diplomatic team. "We need guarantees that go beyond simple promises. We need enforceable protections." The negotiations ultimately stretched across several months, during which sporadic tension continued flaring between remaining Dominion forces and Earth's defenders, testing the fragile progress being made through diplomatic channels. Yet gradually, carefully, a framework began emerging that satisfied the core concerns held by both sides. Earth would retain full sovereignty and independence, free from any further Dominion interference, while the Dominion would receive assurances that Earth harbored no ambitions toward retaliatory conflict extending beyond their own solar system. The formal agreement was finally signed, nearly a year after the first alien vessel had appeared above Earth's cities, marking the official conclusion of a conflict that had transformed humanity's understanding of its place within a vastly larger universe. The ceremony, conducted aboard a neutral vessel positioned at the edge of Earth's solar system, brought together representatives from both sides, including, notably, Savain Dross, whose role throughout the conflict had earned a strange, complicated respect among the very human forces that had fought so fiercely against Dominion ambitions. "You fought differently than any species we have encountered," Savain said quietly to Daniel following the formal signing, the two of them standing together near a viewport overlooking the distant Earth, a moment of unexpected connection between former adversaries. "I do not fully understand what allowed your people to resist so effectively against such overwhelming odds." Daniel considered the question carefully before responding. "We didn't have the luxury of giving up. Everything we had, everyone we loved, was on that world down there. When you're fighting for something that important, you find strength you didn't know you had." Savain nodded slowly, something like understanding, perhaps even respect, visible in an expression difficult to fully interpret given the significant differences separating their species. Word of your world's resistance has already changed a great deal across territories, far beyond what either of us witnessed directly. Whatever comes next for the Dominion, your example will not be easily forgotten. In the years that followed the formal end of hostilities, Earth entered a new, uncertain era, navigating its unexpected place among a vast galaxy of civilizations previously unknown. The technological knowledge gained through the conflict, combined with new diplomatic relationships established with several species who had assisted during the war's later stages, propelled humanity into rapid advancement across numerous fields, transforming the world in ways few could have imagined during those early, desperate days of the conflict. Vesuan Kale, whose careful network of resistance had played such a crucial role in the war's turning point, became an important figure in establishing formal diplomatic relations between Earth and the growing coalition of species who had drawn inspiration from humanity's defiance, a coalition that continued growing in the years following the Dominion's retreat, gradually reshaping the balance of power across significant portions of the galaxy. Daniel, along with Ryan, Megan, and countless other Special Forces operators who had fought throughout the conflict, gradually transitioned away from active combat roles as the years passed, many taking on positions training new generations of soldiers, sharing hard-earned lessons from a war that had tested humanity's resilience in ways no previous conflict ever had. The scars of those difficult months remained with each of them, memories of loss and sacrifice that never fully faded, even as the immediate danger receded into history. Grace Ellison continued her research work, now focused on peaceful applications of the technological knowledge gained during the conflict, contributing to advances that improved life across Earth in countless ways, from medicine to energy production, transforming the painful legacy of war into something constructive for future generations. Laura Bennett, whose small exploration vessel had inadvertently triggered humanity's first contact with a civilization far beyond their own solar system, eventually returned to deep space exploration, though now venturing forth not in fear of what might be discovered, but with cautious optimism regarding the vast, complex universe humanity had learned to navigate through hard-won experience and sacrifice. Years later, as new generations grew up learning about the conflict primarily through history lessons rather than lived experience, the strange, complicated legacy of those difficult early days continued shaping humanity's relationship with the wider galaxy. Diplomatic delegations from newly encountered species, having heard stories passed down through generations regarding Earth's unlikely resistance against the once seemingly invincible Dominion, approached humanity with a careful blend of curiosity and respect, understanding intuitively that this small, determined species should never be underestimated, regardless of whatever technological or numerical advantages an adversary might possess. Among the older generation who had lived through those early, uncertain days of the conflict, the nickname born from fear and confusion during humanity's earliest encounters with the Dominion continued carrying weight, though its meaning had gradually shifted over the years, from something whispered in fear to something spoken with a strange, complicated pride, a reminder of the extraordinary resilience humanity had demonstrated when faced with seemingly impossible odds. Daniel, now considerably older, stood before a gathering of new Special Forces recruits during a training exercise held at a facility built specifically to prepare Earth's continued defenders for whatever challenges the future might bring. Looking out over the young faces before him, eager and uncertain in equal measure, he found himself reflecting on the strange, unexpected journey that had brought him to this moment, from a routine security assignment aboard a small research vessel to becoming, however reluctantly, a symbol of humanity's unbreakable resolve. They called us many things during those early days, he said, addressing the gathered recruits, his voice carrying the quiet authority earned through years of hard-won experience. Fear does strange things to how people, and apparently other species as well, choose to describe what they don't fully understand. But the truth was always simpler than the stories that grew around it. We were never trying to become legends. We were simply people who refused to give up on protecting everything we loved, even when the odds seemed impossible. He paused, looking out over the young faces before him, understanding the weight of the responsibility they were preparing to carry forward into an uncertain future. Whatever challenges you face in the years ahead, remember that resilience matters more than raw strength, that adaptability matters more than any technological advantage, and that the willingness to keep fighting, even when victory seems impossible, is often the very thing that makes victory possible after all. As the training session continued, the sun setting slowly over the distant horizon, Daniel allowed himself a rare moment of quiet reflection, thinking back on everything that had unfolded since that fateful day aboard the Meridian, when 4 soldiers with no understanding of what awaited them had found themselves fighting for humanity's very survival against an enemy from beyond the stars. The galaxy had changed significantly in the years since, reshaped by the ripple effects of Earth's unlikely resistance, a resistance that had inspired countless other species to challenge the assumptions of inevitable dominion dominance that had governed galactic politics for generations. Earth itself had emerged from the conflict transformed, no longer an isolated, vulnerable world unaware of the vast universe surrounding it, but a respected, cautious participant among a growing community of civilizations who understood, through hard-won experience, the true cost of underestimating a determined, resilient species. And though the fear that had once accompanied the whispered nickname carried across distant star systems had long since faded into something closer to respect, the legacy of those early, desperate days remained woven permanently into humanity's understanding of itself, a reminder passed down through generations that even the smallest, most vulnerable among the stars could, through resilience and unbreakable resolve, become something far greater than anyone, including themselves, had ever imagined possible. The story of those first Special Forces operators, of a small vessel called the Meridian, and of a name born from fear and confusion, that eventually became something closer to legend, remained a defining chapter in humanity's history, carried forward not merely as a record of survival, but as a lasting testament to what determination and unbreakable resolve could accomplish against odds that had once seemed entirely, hopelessly insurmountable.